in other words, I think it would be completely unrealistic to expect 50 to 75 years from now that the map that we know of the United States right now will remain intact. That, because certainly history doesn't show that. Wherever you go, boundaries are constantly in flux. Why would we be an exception to that? Especially given our contentious political and cultural landscape right now.
Hey everybody, welcome back. So today I have a great interview to share with you guys. This interview went on about 2 hours, so I decided to split it into two halves. So I'm releasing the first half today, and the second half I'll release in 2 weeks from today. I couldn't really find an ideal place to break between the two halves, so I chose the best place that I could. It's a little bit awkward, but it'll kind of end, and then we'll pick up next week from that point. In this first half, we talk about a lot of general topics. We discuss election forecasting, what's happened in the country over the past 5 years, and where we think we might be headed. And in the second half, we talk specifically about the division in the country and the possibility of secession or some type of dissolution, and the different polling results on that topic, especially a couple of the recent polling results that came out just in the past 6 months or so. So, hope you enjoy. Our guest today began his career as a history teacher at the secondary and college levels. He then worked at Bank of New York Mellon's Central New York Data Analytics team before becoming a partner at John Zogby Strategies in 2016, a market research firm founded by his father, the famous pollster John Zogby. He is the editor of Main Street, K Street, IntelligenSEER, biweekly report, and co-host with his father of the Zogby Report podcast, Real and Unscripted, which you can find on SoundCloud, Apple, Stitcher, and YouTube. Please welcome Jeremy Zogby.
Thanks for having me here, Darren.
Thanks for coming. How are you doing this morning?
It's great. And we have some great weather here. This is upstate New York. We have the four seasons, but we don't get quite the summers you get, but we're thankful for it.
Well, we've had some summers that we don't normally get either, as I'm sure you're aware, with the
drought,
the record-breaking heat and the wildfires, and everything. It's been the past 2 or 3 years have been really unusual. So why don't we start with your own professional background? Your formal education is in history, and you were actually a history teacher for about a decade, if I'm not mistaken.
That's exactly right.
How did you make the transition from academia and education into political polling and public opinion research?
Well, long before I was a teacher, I was working with my dad out in the field. My first job was 10 years old. My dad landed this regular job with the local transit authority. We call them bus surveys. Basically, the transit authority wanted to know, they wanted to update and know how they should allocate their various routes throughout the city of Utica. And so if there was a route that weren't picking up many people, then they could move that driver over to another. It could consolidate, basically. So I would sit on a bus all day long for this one particular route and count where people were getting on and what they were paying with. And so that was like my basic introduction to statistics. I mean, very, very simple, but there was much more to it. There was a cultural experience. There was, I guess you could say, street smarts. I mean, you see a lot of stuff on the public transit authorities when you're 10 years old, especially for a full shift. So started out that, and then when I was old enough to go into the call center, making phone calls, doing the telephone surveys, and then doing some projects during the summer. When I got old enough, my dad would let me analyze crosstabs and write kind of like rough draft reports for the communications teams, and so I really got to learn how to read crosstabs, read data, and formulate questions. And I always knew that's what I wanted to do, but I knew that I knew that because this is what my dad did. If you're analyzing events, you have to be grounded in something, and he was very much grounded in history. And so I said, well, it's always been something that I was interested in and gravitated. So I figured what I'll do is I'll launch my career as a teacher and really get that down, gain some knowledge of history, and then I'm going to be in a much better position to analyze current events, and that's what I did.
Yeah, and I think that is something that's missing from a lot of survey research and opinion polling. Is they're so driven by just crunching numbers. I think that they lose sight of the bigger picture a lot.
I would agree. We're not statisticians. We have close family members who are statisticians who've been doing the statistics for 20 years. Of course, we understand the basic principles, but it's really in how do you frame the questions? How do you frame the questions for the unique projects? That's the other thing, is we don't do just political polls. As you mentioned, we also do a lot of market research, and other kinds of jobs. But how do you look at each unique project and frame the right questions, and then read the data and then explain what the data means? So I mean, it's much more than just statistical modeling. It's also being knowledgeable of geography, regions, localities, politics, culture, so many things, and I think you hit the nail on the head. Interdisciplinary, in other words.
Before we move on to specific issues, and we've kind of already started talking about this, can you just explain for everyone what are the goals of market research, and how does a market researcher specifically go about capturing and interpreting that data to achieve those goals?
Yeah, so whether, and again, this is true of political polling as it is of market research polling. You want to know your place in the marketplace. So if you have a new product or a new service, you probably shouldn't just open up a business not knowing what your competition is, not knowing whether people are even interested in general in what you're going to offer. And then you have to take it a step further and figure out, well, even if you think you have your niche, right, and you've already done some number crunching, and maybe you've looked at your competitors and done some number crunching, and you've determined how your approach is unique. Now, will you test it with the public in the data collection process, in the survey research part? So somebody would contact us and say, we've got a new product. One off the top of my head that was pretty interesting, and this was years ago, so I can talk about this in very broad terms. It was an insurance to protect you against your home going underwater, which I thought was ingenious, right? And so they needed to have the numbers in order to get the investors. So they did a nationwide survey of adults, and we screened for the adults, for the appropriate audience or survey participants, which would be aspiring home buyers, people who are currently renting, or new homeowners as well. And what did they think about this product? Here is how the product worked, and then you'd have them respond to whether they were very favorable or somewhat favorable, all the way to the somewhat unfavorable, very unfavorable, not sure. How likely were they to get this product if they knew X, Y, Z? They even wanted to know what should we name it. So they had kicked around 5 or 7 ideas in their head, and of this list, which one do you think is most effective? And so we tabulate it. We look at the overall results. We break it down by demographics and figure out who's your audience, who's more likely to buy at this price that you're offering for a monthly premium. And what's fascinating is this is applicable in so many areas. This is almost the exact same thing that you do with political polling. Hey, I'm running for mayor. What's my platform? Who says that they would vote for me on election day? How many people? Are they favorable of me or unfavorable of me? What about my opponents? How do I rank up them uh, against my opponents? What's the best message and among who? And so it's very relevant stuff. I'll just say this one more thing. It's best that you don't spend tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars on campaigning without knowing how well liked and where you can make your gains in the community, whether it's a product, service, or someone running for office.
What would you say are the biggest misconceptions that most people have about political polling and public opinion research?
Well, so I would say somewhere along the way in the 90s, polling became synonymous, and I'm going to exaggerate a little here, became synonymous, at least among the pundits, with something like soothsaying and Nostradamus, like the ability to predict. Now, there is a predictive element in polling, in political polling, no question about it. I'll get to that in a second. But I think because of journalists, there are obviously some journalists who know how to read polls and who know how to ask the right kind of questions as far as what's the methodology that you're using, and whether one methodology is more appropriate in one project versus another, and what types of questions are you asking, and all of that. Political polling is predictive because, okay, so we did a poll. We were doing the 2020 election, and election day was November 3rd, and so we did a poll on November 2nd, and so the night before we have our raw data, and in polling you apply weights, which means you get your raw data, but now you have to use very simple equations to match it to the current, whether it could be the census data, basically on population, the most up-to-date data, so that it's a little bit more grounded in reality. Because the raw data form you could have a little bit more men or a little bit more women, or less African Americans or more Hispanics, and so you apply weights, and the way I describe it is you bring it back into reality. And so, but on a political poll the day before the election, what you have to predict is, well, what's the turnout going to be? So I have my raw data that I just gathered from the field. I've applied my weights, but I've been tracking the political polls for months now. And so what I feel is that I think whites are going to turn out. Whites over 65 are actually going to turn out more, because I've been following the news and I see these indicators that they're going to turn out more. I think that, for example, maybe I think that young people just aren't as excited because some events have happened in the last 3 weeks that point to they're not going to come out like they did for Obama. And so this is where intuition comes into play. And so now you're adding to this model your intuition and shaping the numbers. This is the predictive element of what you think voter turnout is going to be the next day. So you're predicting tomorrow, but I don't know, maybe people think that in the most extreme sense that people can predict into a year or two, but I certainly don't claim to know how to do that. I would say probably most pollsters would agree with me on that.
It's almost seems to me like it's like a weather forecast. You're giving a range, like, the high temperatures could be between this and this, and of course, the closer you are to the day that you're forecasting, the more accurate you're going to be. Compared, nobody expects a weather person to forecast 3 months to the day what the
Yeah,
temperature is going to be.
exactly. You're providing a snapshot in time, over time, and leading up to the 2020 election, there were some pretty ridiculous polls. One was showing in Wisconsin, Biden ahead by 17. In Wisconsin, really, right? Wisconsin is a swing state. There are counties within Wisconsin that make it a swing state. That's how tight it is. But as you alluded to, as you're getting closer to the election, those things kind of start disappearing. Like in the final week, a lot of people start getting their act together. But beforehand, you'll see some very wild polls of double digit leads, and it's like, no, listen, we've basically been a divided nation since 2000. I mean, Obama was an exception where he had some pretty strong majorities, more so his first election, but by and large, we've been a very divided nation.
I want to ask you about one other aspect of election forecasting, and you can talk about this in general terms. There are some websites or people who will do a kind of aggregation of polls and run simulations where they have like a computer that models what's going to happen, and they have this enormous computer simulation, almost like a physics experiment, and they feed all the data in, and then they run it like, I don't know, 20,000, 50,000 times, and then they use those outputs from the simulation to make conclusions. And I mean, I'm a mathematician, so I mean, math is my background. I just don't know what exactly to think about that. I mean, that makes sense to me like in physics or something, but I just don't know what I think about it for elections. And
Yeah,
um,
yeah. I mean, let's talk about a specific individual, which I don't mind because I'm not going to I'm not going to go on the offense, but I I feel like maybe what you're talking about sounds a little bit like Nate Silver, right?
a little bit.
Yeah. Um, I think that, and listen, Nate has been very critical towards almost every pollster, and us included. He kind of came on the scene, and he, for like young political junkies, he was like Moses, and he rated pollsters, he aggregated polls, but I don't know, to my knowledge, that he ever conducted a poll. So I'd be interested in whether he actually did that or not. But what Nate Silver did, what I think his contribution was, he got the armchair political junkies, the let's just say political junkies who were following politics, and maybe were following polls, but weren't really looking in depth into polls. He got them to start asking questions. Hey, what's your methodology? Show us the data. If you're going to release a poll, give us a hyperlink so we can see more. And I feel like more people. I feel like we've always been very transparent, or at least as much as we can in the industry. Um, we always link to the crosstabs and the questions so people can see beyond the press release. But he did a real good service to get people to go deeper on that. And I think a lot more people are paying attention to that stuff. But as far as your question I would just follow up your question with another question. I mean, how accurate is he? To my knowledge, he's he's made some forecasting or predictions that have been some right. He's also been grossly wrong on a lot of them. So I would never tell him, hey, stop what you're doing. If you are onto something and you're improving this over time, and it's actually a better, predicting model, then maybe I need to think about shifting gears in my work. you know.
Yeah, I think, and this is getting into the next topic I wanted to talk about, the kind of perception of election polling. I think there was one of the elections that Nate called very accurately. He had like 48 or 49 states correct out of the 50.
Yeah.
And there seemed to be like this general idea that, oh my gosh, she's, like you said, Moses or something. And I think there's a bit of an overreaction. He got it on the nose so much that people kind of overreacted and said, we must take everything that he says as the gospel. And then when they haven't been so accurate lately, I think there's been a little bit of an overreaction in the other direction, where a lot of people are just saying, well, let's just throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's nothing that we can get from this. So can you talk about that, the current state of election polling? And I think there's been a lot of soul searching and kind of gnashing of teeth over 2016 and 2020.
Yeah.
Because they were, well, you could say they're off the mark, would be putting it mildly. There's other ways you could put it too.
Well, you got to look at the winners and the losers. Right now we're looking at the Olympics, right? And so, one way to look at it is you could say you could focus on the 17 or the 15 people who you thought were going to get a gold medal who didn't, but you should also look at who got the gold medal. And so, in other words, there were polls that were right. There were polls that were accurate. There were polls that were not too far off. I of course have to mention that we nailed it in 2020. We had Biden. Our final poll showed Biden ahead by 5. The popular vote, 5 percentage points, and that's basically what Biden won by. So, and then there were I think Trafalgar was pretty good. Again, Trafalgar Group were correct in 2016, and there's a handful of others. So people should go to the, if you're interested in this stuff, go to the realclearpolitics.com and look up the past presidential polls and see that there were people who were within a margin and they got it right. But then there were those, as we discussed weeks leading up, were showing a Biden blowout, over double digit. And so, I think, just to be fair in the coverage, we, at the same time that we look at those who were wrong, we should focus on those who are right. So I think the climate, of course, maybe because it tends to be sensationalist, and then also just following the general negative mood in political coverage in general, it tends to be contentious. Everything regarding politics now becomes contentious. But in reality, months after the 2020 election, we still have clients calling us and saying, we need a reading. We need the pulse. We need to know about this or about that. And obviously, you still see polls being reported in the news and people citing polls. It's just part of that election mania, I think.
Yeah, I never bought going into the November 3rd, the double digit stuff. I just had a sense that was just, that couldn't be right. That it was going to be a lot closer than that. And I don't know, maybe it has something to do with, I think you talked about this, a lot of it has to do with the weighting, kind of your modeling of turnout. I think a lot of pollsters overestimated Democratic turnout or maybe underestimated Republican turnout.
Yeah, it did. The question is whether it was deliberate or whether it's a result of bias. And I can't prove and say that it was deliberate, although you almost got to say you shouldn't be surprised. especially what happened given 2016, where again, the polls leading up to the election were, oh, it's a Hillary blowout. Oh, forget about it. Trump doesn't have a chance. And meanwhile, some polls were oversampling Democrats, and like you said, maybe they were just reasoning, well, Democrats are going to turn out like wild because they're scared of Mussolini, or the American Mussolini. All right, and but that didn't happen. But so I think unfortunately what happens is the echo chamber phenomenon, where if you live in a power center like Washington D.C. or Manhattan, and obviously a lot of people with in the power centers with money, they fly and they go on vacation, but chances are they're not coming up to upstate New York where I live, or they're not going to they're not going through Oklahoma, that's for sure. And so they're just surrounded by people, their neighbors, who they work with, their friends and their family, who are all, there's just this very narrow loop of feedback. And so their world, which is a very tiny world, although powerful, they are honestly saying, I can't see how this happens. I don't get it. And I think that's why we've always had an advantage, because we live, not only do we live in a district that's a swing district, but we also live in what we call real America, a small city, a city that's seen its days, a city where they used to have a beautiful main street that's been, decimated, but coming back. And so, if you don't visit real America and you're far away from it, you're never going to get real America.
Yes, that's true. I think it runs both directions. There's definitely these power centers where they're completely out of touch with what's going on in a lot of parts of the country. On the other hand, I've talked to people who are in red states or in Trump country, and to them it's just inconceivable that Biden would win a state like California by however many, 30 points or almost. They can't wrap their minds around it, and they chalk it up to Dominion voting systems and rigged elections and fraud. And so I think it runs in a lot of different directions. When you said people get in these echo chambers.
Oh yeah, no, I would agree with that. And social media certainly doesn't help that. These algorithms. My perception of it is ever since the FANG economy, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Google, which has basically become how most of us get our information in one way or another, because the platforms determine what's shareable, what's not shareable. They determine what you see based on these algorithms. And so, people as a result are kind of just going down their own versions of the rabbit hole and into their own versions of reality. And it's too bad, right? Because we should be crossing over. We should be open to hearing both sides, as many sides as we can, not just two sides.
Turning to some more general topics, I want to ask you about what you think of the general state of American politics. And just to be clear, I ask you this not in terms of your own personal experience, although your own personal opinion and experience, but really based upon the survey data that you've collected and analyzed and interpreted over the past few years.
Yeah. So the general, the overarching, I guess, mood. There's a lot of distrust. There's Everybody knows there's stark division. Unfortunately, the two sides, the Democrats and the Republicans, have we've moved away from the middle. Moderates don't really, although moderates are many, they don't really have a voice. There's still a substantial amount of moderates, but it's the politics is it's incredibly divisive, and I think a lot of it has to do with the major platforms of information, not just television networks, but also their versions of online news and as well as social media platforms, and people are at each other's throats verbally, and I think the most important thing to highlight is that there is a complete loss of empathy. And somebody with my background in world history would call that tribal, right? Because the very essence of a tribal society is a limited experience. It's very difficult to understand somebody beyond your kinship, beyond your village, beyond your locality. That's the essence of tribalism. And that's unfortunately what's going on in the whole nation, is that the other is the enemy. Yet because I by and large broken free of I'm independent. I'll be honest with you. I haven't voted since 2012 because to me it's obvious that both parties are antagonizing. To me, like if somebody's going to go up in arms about January 6th and say, oh, those right-wing domestic terrorists, I'm going to say, okay, January 6th was very dramatic, but do you remember 2016? Do you remember the hysteria that we had a president that was elected completely illegitimate? He was a puppet of Vladimir Putin. There was such thing as a honeymoon, a presidential honeymoon, where like the first 100 days you got a break. It was like, give the guy a chance, give him 100 days to get something done, to prove himself. Trump, in my opinion, was the first president that didn't even have that, and I don't even like the guy, and I can admit that. And so the roots of January 6th and the denial of 2020 are found in 2016. And if anybody goes and listens to our podcast leading up to the election in November of 2020, my father and I were saying it doesn't matter who wins. They're going to reject it no matter what. That's where we are at. Incredible division and contentious politics, labeling over listening, a complete lack of empathy.
You must have a copy of my notes, because that's exactly the next thing that I was going to bring up.
Really? Okay.
I think we're. I was going to mention the lack of acceptance of election results, and I think we're staring down kind of the barrel of a gun coming up to the midterms, and then especially in 24. I think you're right about 2016, and I'm a leftist, but I'm not a partisan Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that, although I think there is a fundamental difference in that Hillary Clinton did verbally concede. She attended the inauguration. She assisted with the transfer of power and didn't try to interfere with that. But psychologically, there was not an acceptance of the legitimacy of the result.
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone can deny that. And there was a similar type of, I would call it conspiracy theorizing about, they take a kernel of truth about, Russia had some internet farm that did something on Facebook, and so a few other, some of his business connections with Russia, and they manufactured this whole conspiracy about collusion with the Kremlin, and that really polluted the discourse, I think. And I know a lot of Democrats are going to disagree with me on that, but I remember at the time watching Oh, what was his name? He has a show where he looked like he was broadcasting from his basement. He used to be on MSNBC. But he was just going on and on about the Russians this and the Russians that, and they're just the most vile kind of xenophobic ranting. And I agree with you. I think that there is a progression from the 2016 to 2020 in that we've had 2 consecutive presidential elections where, in both cases, the campaign that lost, or the half of the country that lost the election, really did not accept the legitimacy of the result. And that's very dangerous, especially if it happens twice in a row.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to happen again in 2024. It's almost certain to happen again.
Well, looking back on it, a lot of people thought that happened in 2000. A lot of people thought it happened in 2004. That's something that's been swept under the carpet. And for better or for worse, I don't know, but I don't think people were ready back then to have that. They were, but I think they just said, all right, we got to move on. But I mean, there was one thing that jumped out in what you said, where you said Hillary conceded. She ceremonially oversaw the transfer of power. I mean, obviously Trump did eventually as well. But it was just, yes, the Democrats accepted, but then from day one, it was informational warfare. I mean, it was open warfare. I mean, whether I was in the airport, whether I was out to eat or to meet with somebody, if the TV was on, you actually saw journalists yelling. I mean, they were almost foaming at the mouth. And I remember running into people, and they were saying, "I'm getting sick. I'm getting sick," and they were serious. They were physically getting ill because the information that was bombarding them was projecting an anger, and they were internalizing it, and they were carrying the anger, and it was sowing the seeds of division. And I'm not going to say Trump should get away with what he did. The same thing happened, but I think it's bigger than people need to get beyond left, right, and Democrat and Republican. It's bigger than that. Whatever happened on November 3rd, if it were the exact opposite, if Trump had clearly won, the Democrats were not going to accept it. Maybe it wouldn't have looked exactly like January 6th. I don't know what it would have looked like, but I know they weren't going to accept it because a lot of them were saying it. A lot of them were saying we're not going to accept it. That's a bigger cultural political phenomenon. Those are plate tectonics in the political landscape that are bigger than Biden or Clinton or Trump. And I think one of the biggest problems is party allegiance. I don't get party allegiance. I understand religious and philosophical allegiance. I can understand somebody saying, hey, my family have been Catholic for 1,500 years, or hey, we've been Muslim. We can trace our Muslim lineage back to Muhammad, or even 500 years ago, or whatever, 300 years. But parties, we're talking about 2-3 generations. Why do you have to be beholden to a party and do whatever they say?
That's true. I want to push back on you a little bit on, because this is something I've heard. You talked about it with your dad on the podcast and mentioned it before, and I've heard religious leaders and community leaders and so forth talk about this. I think it's a good sentiment to bring up, and I think it's a positive approach. But I don't think it's necessarily going to lead everywhere that people think it is, and that is the idea of toning down the temperature, toning down the volume, turning the temperature down, sitting down with people and talking with them. I think that's really necessary. I think it's I think it's a good thing to do, because I do think we do need to tone down the volume and get the temperature down. My point is that I think that even if we sit down and we really are empathetic and listen and start the process of rehumanizing and not, dehumanizing the other side, I think even after that, I think there's still going to be disagreements that are too fundamental. So I think,
sure, of course,
sitting down and talking, I think it will help address the escalating violence and that kind of thing. But I'm not sure that it's going to necessarily solve. I don't know if it's going to necessarily solve the disagreements. Let me think through some topics. There's a certain segment of the population that they're kind of set on outlawing abortion, and there's another. I mean, I know the vast majority of Californians they're never going to accept living in a country where abortion is outlawed, and that's not going to be that's irreconcilable. If one side is dead set on overturning Roe v. Wade or even outlawing abortion nationwide, and the other side is dead set on maintaining that, I don't see how you bridge that divide. And there's a whole range of other issues that I could go through. That, I mean, one of the big issues for me is healthcare. It's very personal for me from experience, and I just think it's barbaric, the kind of healthcare system that we have, and the fact that we haven't done something to address it, to have some kind of single payer or nationalized universal healthcare system. To me, I don't want to live in a country or a society that doesn't address that. I've thought about it a long time, that one issue by itself is a reason that I've thought about leaving the country, moving to another country. Until eventually I just thought, well, most of the people in my community, in my state, agree with me more. So why should I leave the country when everybody around me feels the same? But there's a large segment of the population that views any kind of government intervention into healthcare or some kind of Medicare for all system as, Stalin is coming back from the grave. It's communists, and I just don't see. And those are just two issues. I don't see how that gets resolved, even if we tone down the temperature and have a sit down and talk and listen. I don't know where that goes.
Well, that's a great point, but I feel like in the 78 episodes that I've been doing this podcast, and obviously I wouldn't expect you to have listened to all of that, but I've had a lot of recurring themes, and I've explored a lot of topics, but there are overarching themes, and that is one thing that we and myself have brought up is and I think I use this phrase, listening over labeling. And so while that gets us back to civility, and that ensures that we don't rip apart the social fabric, because I'm sure you would agree, nothing good comes from a torn apart social fabric. That is a breeding ground for serious bloody rebellion, as history has shown. And I don't think we want to go down that road. I don't think Americans are with the look. There's a lot of pain in this nation. There's a lot of suffering, but we still have it pretty good compared to a lot of people. I don't think we're ready to lose that. In fact, I know we're not ready to lose that standard of living. What vestiges we have of it. So step one is to listen more. Understand that by labeling and name calling and actually calling people the most vile and thinking of them as the most vile is just not going to work. And so that's an exercise, but you're right, it's not it's not the end. You have to go to the next step. And the next step, and this is something that I've been talking about, is we really have to go back and study our original principles. And remember, the nation was very divided. It's not like all the founding fathers agreed. Basically, you had the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. It's my belief that despite going back to the 1800s, and there were obviously some clear contradictions with their idea of equality and freedom, right? Because we had slavery. I think if we just look at the substance of what they were debating about and compare it to today, I feel like we've lost a lot of substance. We still have issues that are important and that are in people's hearts, but it's becoming clouded with that loss of empathy, with the labeling and the notion that the other is going to ruin this country. Now, make no mistake about it, that existed in the first decades. That the debates were very hot. I mean, obviously, it led to the death of one of the founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton. But my only point is that the debates on what is the nature of government, what is the scope and size of government, are always critical. They're universal. They're timeless. And I think we need to reinvestigate that, not to say that therein are going to be the perfect answers for the 21st century, but to get our minds into those gears again, to understand and revisit. That's how the Italians had the Renaissance, is they went back to the classics. And so we have our own little version of the classics. Of course, that's being attacked. There are people who think that classical studies or just studying writings of the founding fathers is not good. I would highly disagree with that. We're talking about people who came from the tradition of the Enlightenment, and again, they didn't have all the answers, but there was far more substance. I think there's far more substance in debating Lockean philosophy or Hobbesian philosophy versus the same old CNN, Fox News stuff that you hear on television.
Well, yeah, the level of discourse in the mainstream media is definitely pretty low.
Yeah. Sorry, that was a long answer. I'm trying to shorten these.
I agree that we can go back to fundamental principles. I think something over the past 18 months, I've mentioned this in my podcasts myself, is if you ask people, do you support XYZ good things? Do you support freedom, liberty, these different notions? You'll have widespread agreement. Like, I mean, what percentage of the people are going to say, no, I'm against freedom? I mean, the issue is that people use these words and they mean different things to different people. So when you say, well, we can all rally around freedom. Well, when a conservative in the middle of the country says, I can rally around freedom and I believe in freedom, they could mean something very different than what I mean when I say, I believe in freedom. And that's, I guess what I'm saying is that it's easy to go to these fundamental principles and say, we believe in these words, but the interpretation of those words, I think, is the issue. And that's been something from the beginning of the country. I think that does go back to the beginning of the country. It's been something that's been debated.
Yeah, I mean, it's like we don't even have civics anymore, right? We got social studies. Frank Zappa used to joke about that, by the way. He's from your neck of the woods. What does that say? What does that say that how does a society disband civics? How do they get over that and say, well, that's a thing of the past? So imagine if we returned to curriculums that had more emphasis on civics. I mean, I think a lot of a lot of our problems would be solved in the long run, not immediately, but just right there to get people more into the gear of civic minded individuals versus partisan, whether, and look, we say woke and we think of woke and we think of it on the left, but there's I like to say there's wokeism on the right. And so I think populism can be a good thing, but I think, again, when it's inflammatory, just like our hyper partisan nature, we're essentially, what we're doing is what the Romans did. You gather a bunch of people in the hippodrome and you get them cheering for a color, and you think that the other color is the worst, nastiest thing, and your color is good. Again, tribalism.
You've talked about the idea of centralization versus decentralization. Could you talk a little bit about that? And I'll just, before you start, I'll throw in my 2 cents. So I've always been kind of on the left. So I've always had maybe it's not a certain affinity, but a willingness to have some degree of centralization. Whether it's in government or different organization. But I've kind of come to think the last year or couple years that maybe just the size and scope of something like 300 million people it's just it's so large, especially in the United States when it's so geographically and culturally kind of disparate, that some kind of decentralization maybe is more appropriate. That it's too big to manage at that level. Is that kind of what when you talk about decentralization versus centralization?
Yeah, and that, of course, is one of the major topics of what I talk at when I was just saying that, going back to what the founding fathers debated about was, what is federalism? What is the role between federal and state governments? Madison, of course, was the bridge between Hamilton and Jefferson, and which Madison created this elaborate system of checks and balances that served both for federalism, because he wasn't entirely ready to go Jefferson's way of we're a confederacy of states and there should be no strong central government. And if there is, it's for very few things. But yeah, I mean, that's what it is we've had in the last 100 years no shortage of the state or the government claiming that it has the solutions to more and more of our problems. And so we're now getting to a point where I asked the question, at what point do we say the federal government should not micromanage this aspect of my life? I could very much see a situation where if a line isn't drawn now, the federal government and even state governments are going to increasingly determine almost every aspect of our life. And so decentralization is, I guess, the first step would be, well, the 10th Amendment, right, says that all the powers not mentioned in the Constitution are reserved to the state. So can the state override what a federal law or regulation puts into existence? Well, certainly the 10th Amendment says that. Certainly the founding of our country agreed with that. So I would just start off there. I think we have a lot more to say on this topic.
It's a little bit of a paradox for me because, in a sense, part of my issue with the federal government is, well, I don't agree with what they do spend money on, a lot of it, like the military and things like that. But my other issue with it is that they're not spending money on things that I think the government has a role to play in. So I mentioned healthcare. So it's kind of a paradox in that I'm in favor of a form of decentralization to the state level for the sake of the state taking a more active role that it's not, that the federal government is not taking. You see the kind of contradiction there.
Yeah, no, I do, but I mean, and this is another thing. So you were talking about complexity. So this is a geographically very large nation, one of the top 5 in the world in terms of landmass. 330 million people, roughly. And how does that work over time? What government has successfully over time maintained some kind of stability and for its people over centuries? Eventually things break down. Eventually, whether that's just looking at maps in general, I mean, in other words, I think it would be completely unrealistic to expect 50 to 75 years from now that the map that we know of the United States right now will remain intact. That, because certainly history doesn't show that. Wherever you go, boundaries are constantly in flux. Why would we be an exception to that? Especially given our contentious political and cultural landscape right now.
I think if you had, well, you were in Czechoslovakia. If you had Czech Republic. If you had spoken to around 1987 or 1988, if you'd spoken to people there and said, in a few years' time, the Berlin Wall will come down, the Soviet Union will more or less peacefully dissolve into component parts. People would have thought you were nuts. They would have, it would have been complete disbelief. No one would have taken you seriously. And yet it happened. So I just think people shouldn't be so presumptuous to think that they know what direction things are heading. I think the Soviet Union is an example to show that kind of thing can happen. And with the Soviet Union, at least it was relatively peaceful. I hope that's a model for us if we do go that direction. That if we do end up having a division that does result in some kind of dissolution or separation, my hope is it just goes in a non-violent direction. I just don't want to see. I don't want to see this escalating levels of violence, and because that just doesn't end well.
No, it doesn't. And anything that's born in violence has more. It just makes it that much harder to get over, right? It carries baggage with it. But to go back to your earlier point about, you said, well, I'm going to take you for task on this. I don't think that the people are going to lower the temperature and that people are going to listen more. And I agree with you. I'm more or less saying what needs to happen. And then, of course, the next step to go back to educating ourselves on more substantive knowledge about politics, and not just obsessing over this political spectrum of where you fall, right? And the other side being bad. But unless I'm misunderstanding you, I think I would agree that it's not going to happen. I don't think people are going to tone it down. I think. Well, I guess why don't we just get into what is the likelihood of some kind of secession happening?
Okay, we can go that direction.
What do you think?
So that is the first half of my interview with Jeremy. If you want to listen to the second half, it'll be released in a couple weeks, where I answer his question and we go on to talk a lot more about the division, sentiment about secession or independence, and how we can interpret all of this data that we're going to be talking about. So hope you'll join us in a couple weeks for the second half of this interview.